I think that as I approached this book, I wanted to keep the aperture quite tight on the Bretler family because they are the heart of the story. And it's a very emotional story, I feel like. And I also feel as though for me as a writer, and I hope for readers, any of us, we grow up in families, right? We relate and connect with our families and our family histories and that sense of how we're formed. And I think any of us, who've had children, who have siblings, have parents, have had these moments where on the one hand, these are the people that you know the best in the world and who, in theory, know you the best. On the other hand, there are these kind of strange moments when you realize that maybe you don't know them as well as you thought you did. And I think particularly for parents, there's this sense that you raise a child and it feels like the child is just kind of wet clay in your hands and you're going to be able to shape them as you would and maybe recreate them in your own image. And then something happens usually where you get kind of a flash and you realize this child they're going to be their own person and they can surprise you. And that was something that I wanted to kind of keep at the forefront of this story and not lose. Another aspect of this book that was a bit unusual for me was that I had access to the central figures. I mean, there were some people I didn't have access to who wouldn't talk to me, but the Bretlers did. And so over the course of 2 years, I spent just hundreds of hours talking with them and texting with them and emailing with them and spent a lot of time with them face to face, a lot of time on the phone. And so that was kind of fun for me as a writer. I usually don't have that kind of unfettered access to the people I was talking about. And they were really bracingly, kind of unusually honest and forthright. There's a lot of stuff in the book that I think makes the Bretlers uncomfortable to have in the book. And yet they, in a kind of extraordinary way, they recognized, partially because I was trying to persuade them, but they recognized ultimately that it needed to be in there, that the only way to tell this story was in a kind of unblinking, warts and all sort of way. And so for me as a writer, that felt like an opportunity because I was able to kind of get in and tell a story in a slightly different way than I have before. And as a consequence, I feel as though this is probably of the books I've written, this is probably the most emotionally vivid because you had these people who, in a way I'll always be grateful for, sort of opened themselves up to me. They opened up their family, their lives, their very, very personal history. And the job for me was, how do you then capture that and distill it in a way that will really resonate with readers on the page? I don't know. I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years and I think my bedside manner's probably gotten a bit better over time. I think there is a sort of emotional intelligence that you do develop over many years of interviewing different kinds of people. There's a humility that I've learned along the way, particularly dealing with people who've gone through trauma of one sort or another. In the end, for one reason or another, over the course of my career, I've spent a lot of time talking to people who've experienced violence or experienced loss, experienced tragedy. And I think that as someone who's been fairly lucky in that I've been spared that kind of thing, at least up to now in my life, it's important to sort of stay very humble and respectful and empathetic. And I hope that that's something that I can kind of get across to the people I'm talking with. But honestly, I think a lot of the time it's like, it's your body language as much as anything. It's your willingness to listen. It's nothing that you say. Sometimes it's your kind of readiness to not jump in and just kind of let the person tell you the story and take it where it goes. One of the things that's been strange for me the last few years is that and this is certainly not always the case, but sometimes it's the case that people do a bit of due diligence on me before we sit down and talk. And I have there's a kind of reputation that precedes me, which sometimes is helpful in the sense that when I'm making the case to somebody that they should talk to me, I can say, look, here's some of my other work. You can read it, you can read about it, you can get a sense of the approach that I take. A lot of the time what I'm having to say is I'm responsible, I'm ethical, I'll take this seriously, and I'll tell the story with a kind of nuance and rigor. And, listen, the truth is that journalists are not widely trusted, right? There are reasons, maybe good reasons, why a lot of the time people have reservations about sitting down with somebody like me. And so it's helpful to have other work that's out there. It can also be a challenge because, one of my books in particular, Say Nothing, is a book about a notorious murder in 1972. And after 4 years of working on that book, at the very end of the process, I figured out who committed the murder and ended up naming the person in the book. And so on a kind of narrative level, it makes for a very satisfying ending because you get to the end of this book, which is kind of a whodunit, and in the end I tell you whodunit. But it's a tricky one in terms of the expectations that can create in people that I talk to. So to give you a specific example, with Matthew and Rochelle Bretler, when I first met them, they had a real sense of grievance because their son's death was essentially an unsolved mystery. And because the Metropolitan Police had botched the investigation so badly and hadn't really given them answers and refused to take any ownership of the fact that they had dropped the ball in such a manner. And I had to have this conversation with the Bretlers because one thing I always try and do with people who are talking to me is be as transparent as possible so as not to create any false expectations. So I had to say, listen, I desperately want to tell this story and I would love for you to open up to me and go on the record and allow me to tell it. But I don't want you to do it in some unspoken expectation that if you do, what you'll get in exchange is that I will crack the case, that this will be a book like Say Nothing, and we'll get a kind of satisfying click of resolution at the end in which I deliver a kind of justice that the authorities couldn't, or in which the Metropolitan Police reopens the investigation or issues some kind of apology. I can't promise you that. And I don't want to have some unspoken thing where I'm basically with a kind of wink and a nod suggesting that there's a quid pro quo here. You open up to me, and then I will deliver that for you. Because it would be unfair to you if there's some sort of suggestion of that, but also kind of unfair to me to have to write the book feeling as though that's the bar that I have to surmount. Because the truth is that Say Nothing was kind of an outlier. That was a sort of weird freak case, and not the kind of thing that's necessarily going to be replicable for me as a reporter. It's a strange thing, but what I have found with not just the Bretlers, but other people who I interview or come to know my work is that the best thing is just always to be very upfront with people and to surface. I find it's very good to sometimes just take whatever the subtext of any conversation is and just say, at the risk of being a little too obvious and on the nose here, I want to take the subtext and just make it text. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about your expectations and what I can do, because the last thing I want to do is create some false expectation on your part or take advantage of some false expectation on your part. I think it's best that we kind of see each other clearly as we get into this and we both understand where it's going. This is the fourth book I've written that started as an article in The New Yorker. I've been writing for The New Yorker for 20 years. And one of the wonderful things about The New Yorker is that they give me lots of room to roam. So I can write these pieces that are quite long by journalistic standards. And I love that. I love that I can spend 6, 8, 10 months, a year researching a piece, and then I can write something really long. I mean, the kind of piece that would, if you're really reading it, it's going to take you an hour to make your way through it. And it's interesting because what that means journalistically is most of the time I'm telling a pretty exhaustive version of the story. And the vast majority of the time, over the course of my 2 decades doing this, I get to the end of a story, I feel as though I've done it. I've told what for me is the kind of absolute version of this story, and I tend not to look back. There have been exactly 4 times where I got to the end of writing the long magazine article and felt, oh gosh, I've just scratched the surface. There's so much more here. And that's usually something that sort of starts to creep up on me as I'm going. I think you do all this reporting, all this research. For me, most of the process is actually research. The writing usually happens quite quickly at the end. That's true with the articles and with the books. And so there's always this moment where you've gathered this huge sort of compost heap of research and interviews, and you've got all your transcripts and statistics and history and all the rest of it. And then there's this question of, well, how do I fit this into the container I have? Most of the time, I feel as though an article is an article, and that's what it wants to be. There've just been this handful of occasions when I feel like, oh, there's so much more here. And in the case of London Falling, what happened was I'd been talking with my longtime book editor in New York about what my next book would be. And we had lunch when I was working on the story. And I started telling him about Matthew and Michelle Bretler and about Zac and about London and all the twists and turns and the kind of strangeness of this process of revelation for this family who, if you read the book, you'll see there's a lot of the Bretlers, you're very kind of intimate with the Bretlers, and you're going into the story, and a lot of what happened was that they would sort of encounter something and they would think that it was one thing, and then there'd be this revelation, and it turned out to be something else. And all those little kind of narrative switchbacks along the way, where you're with them and you kind of come in and it's just these sort of, these kind of layers of the onion all the way in. All of that is pretty rich. Like that's my kind of jam, my kind of story. And as I talked to my editor in New York, Bill Thomas, over the course of the lunch, he sort of said at a certain point, I think this might be the next book. But I didn't want to write the book unless the Bretlers were on board. And so in this case, what that meant was there was a New York article. Even before I'd finished the article, I was saying to the family, I think there might be a book here, but I also wouldn't want to do it unless you were okay with the idea of a book. And we're not going to know that until you've read the piece. When we sort of finalized the piece, and I actually flew off to India with my family. I was in Udaipur when the piece was published, and the Bretlers took a day or two to read it and think about it. And then they called me and they said, we're on board for a book. And so it was this kind of amazing moment for me, because then we're off to the races. If I'm being honest, yeah, I feel intimidated all the time. I mean, in part because people are trying to intimidate me. There's not a lot of ambiguity about it. Often I'm getting letters from lawyers, very threatening letters from lawyers. That was the case on this project. A number of people that I wrote about in this book hired lawyers to send me unfriendly letters. I've gotten a lot of unfriendly legal letters over the years. I had a kind of epistolary relationship with this one lawyer for the Sackler family. We used to joke that we could have wallpapered our bathroom with letters from this one guy. And then there's other kinds of intimidation. I mean, this story involves a number of gangsters, and some of them I got to know. I tell a story at the very end of the book about Andy Baker, who's a gangster who features in this book, who knew Verinder Sharma, one of the main characters in the book. And Andy Baker was somebody I tracked down. He had been in prison. He got out of prison, and that was when I got to know him. He's actually back in prison now. But the first time I met Andy Baker, he We met at a coffee shop. We were introduced by somebody, and he shook my hand, asked if I'd like a coffee, and then with a big jovial smile on his face, asked about my wife and children and mentioned their names, which I hadn't told him. And he wasn't threatening me. He was just asking after my wife and children and letting me know that he knows what their names are. And I should say, Andy Baker and I ended up having a pretty good relationship. He still calls me from prison. We found a wavelength on which to connect, and he was very helpful for me as I was writing the book. I mean, he shared some really useful information. I think there are some really good moments in the book that came from him. But I also needed to tell his story in a way that was unblinking, and so I certainly didn't put any varnish on his criminal history in the book. To his credit, he said to me, I just want you to tell the truth. That's the most important thing. As long as you're truthful, I'm okay with it. But he's an intimidating guy. I mean, he's someone whose whole DNA is it has evolved around the concept of intimidation. I think he's intimidating without even trying to be. And I think sometimes he does try and be intimidating. I have a kind of allergy to journalists who talk too much about their own daring do. So I would never, I don't have any desire to kind of make myself come off as too brave. I have, a colleague at the New Yorker who goes to Ukraine and he's in a trench with shells going off around him. And that's a level of bravery that I couldn't summon, I don't have, and I wouldn't pretend to have. So I'm not cavalier about any of this stuff. I'm pretty careful about it. But in that spirit, yeah, I mean, I get intimidated because the work is sometimes intimidating. Yeah, I wouldn't use the word ruthlessness, but I think it's important if you're a journalist or an author writing serious nonfiction to remember that your fundamental allegiance is to the truth and to your readers more than it is to the people that you're writing about, which doesn't mean that you are betraying the people you write about or you're dishonest with them. I try and be very, very straightforward with people all the time about the fact that I want to tell the fullest and most comprehensive and accurate version of a story, and that that's what I owe my readers, and that usually that means that even if there are people who I'm quite sympathetic with, who I'm writing about, there will be a kind of element of discomfort for them in what I write. I sometimes tell people who I'm profiling for the New Yorker, when you read this profile, it's not going to be like looking at a photograph of yourself. It'll be like looking at a painting of yourself. It's kind of through an interpretive. I'm not going to see you the way you see yourself, and that's not a problem. That's not a flaw. That's actually the way it should be. That I'm not in the business of PR. If you see a kind of no makeup, no trick lighting, super close up, even a photo of yourself, it's a little arresting sometimes. You think, oh God, is that the way people see me? Sometimes when you hear your voice recorded, you think, that's not what I sound like. And there's that sort of element of dissonance. And so what that means in practice for me is, to take London Falling as an example, there are things in the book that I think if the Bretlers had their way, wouldn't necessarily be there. There are details that probably make them somewhat uncomfortable. But to their enormous credit, over the course of really getting to know each other over the last 2 years, I sort of had to make the case to them, listen, the only way to tell this story, really, a story that's partially about lies, right, is in a kind of bracingly honest way. So ultimately, they came around to the idea that there were details in the book about their family history and about Zac's life and some of Zac's secrets, that might might leave them feeling a little queasy, right? Thinking that anybody can pick up this book about their family, and that kind of thing might be in there. But I think that in the end, they're really sophisticated people, and they understood the project that I was engaged in. And so I was able to write a book that felt really honest. It didn't feel like I'm doing PR for this family, or like I'm kind of airbrushing away the little elements of the story that might be uncomfortable for them. And I feel like that's the least that I owe to my readers. And in a strange way, I actually feel like even the Bretlers, what I owe them is to write a book that feels really deeply truthful. And so it's a process sometimes to kind of bring people around to understanding that. But they did. And I think the book is stronger for it, and I'll always be grateful to them.